They said it was impossible. That a country like Ethiopia, without oil, without influence, without permission, could never dam the Nile. And yet, the waters stopped. For the first time in over a century. The Nile no longer flows according to colonial maps. It flows to the rhythm of a nation that refused to beg. Ethiopia didn't just build a dam. It built defiance. Funded by farmers, teachers, and street vendors. Built in storms, under threats, and without loans. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not just concrete and turbines, it's Africa writing a new sentence in its own language. But now, questions rise like mist off the reservoir. Is this dam a blessing or a fuse? Why are Egypt and Sudan threatening war over water? And why does this single dam terrify an entire geopolitical order? If you believe Africa should no longer ask permission to grow, this is your moment to listen and to speak. Drop your thoughts below, and subscribe to follow the journey of African sovereignty, one dam. One continent, one destiny. It happened without warning. A breaking news alert flashed across Ethiopian television: GERD is done. The final turbine has gone live. 14 years of work. Over 6,000 megawatts. 0 foreign loans. In Addis Ababa, cheers echoed like thunder. This was not just a national announcement. It was a rupture in the silence of a continent long told to wait. To borrow, to ask for permission. As engineers confirmed full activation, the cameras turned, not to Europe, not to Washington, but to the banks of the Nile, where Africa had just reclaimed something priceless: control. And now the world watched. Egypt stiffened. Sudan hesitated. But Ethiopia moved forward. The river had changed course. And so had history. They spent a century claiming the Nile as their own. Ethiopia didn't ask. Ethiopia turned off the tap. But that story didn't begin with a turbine. It began with a question whispered in classrooms, farms, and coffee stalls across the highlands. What if we just built it ourselves? No IMF loans. No Chinese debt traps. No Western advisors signing off blueprints. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was born not in boardrooms, but in the grit of everyday people. Teachers gave up months of salary. Farmers sold goats to buy national bonds. Shopkeepers pinned construction photos next to icons of saints. Diaspora Ethiopians wired savings back home. Not to invest, but to belong. They were told it couldn't work. You're too poor. It's too ambitious. You'll beg for help eventually. But instead of breaking, Ethiopia built. And what they built was not just concrete. It was a wall between who Africa had been told to be and who it chose to become. At 145 meters tall and 1.8 kilometers long, GERD was an engineering leap into the unknown. Ethiopia had never attempted anything close. There was no playbook. No experienced local workforce. Just a dream, and a refusal to outsource it. They trained young engineers on site. Taught welders who'd never held a torch. Built roads through jungle and heat. Hauled turbines through mountains and mud. They failed. They recalibrated. They fell. They rose again. And every time the world said, they can't, they answered with more steel, more stone, more belief. But belief alone doesn't pour concrete. The real struggle wasn't just the dam's height. It was the depth of resistance. Egypt lobbied the UN, Western newspapers ran stories questioning water security. Diplomats whispered warnings of instability. Threats, some subtle, some not, came like monsoon winds. At one point, a senior Egyptian official even suggested, all options are on the table. That wasn't about diplomacy. That was about fear. Fear that GERD wasn't just a dam, it was a declaration. A declaration that Africa no longer needed permission. The tension grew. Turbine shipments were delayed due to international pressure. Parts held at ports. Contractors withdrawn. But Ethiopia dug deeper, literally and figuratively. When money ran out, they printed bonds. When equipment broke, they fixed it themselves. When morale fell, they sent messages to workers. You're not just building power. You're building the future. Some slept in tents for years. Some never saw their families. Some died. Those names aren't on the turbine casings. But they are engraved in the silence that follows when the power finally flows, and a once dark village lights up. And now the turbines hum. 6 of them already feed electricity to the grid, powering schools, hospitals, and factories. The remaining 5 wait. Once operational, GERD will double Ethiopia's entire national energy supply, making it not just self-sufficient, but a regional supplier. Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti, they all stand in line. For power. For partnership. For what comes next. And yet, the world hesitates to celebrate. Why? Because GERD breaks the script. The one that says African progress must be imported, financed by outsiders, certified by Paris or Washington. GERD rips that page out. This is African sovereignty, engineered. It's the same spirit we've seen rising in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are saying enough to dependency and yes to building in-house. In the West, they called it nationalism. In Africa, we call it breathing. This dam wasn't built by aid. It was built by conviction. It was built with hands blistered by heat, hearts armored by pride, and minds sharpened by necessity. It was built the African way, slowly, painfully, stubbornly, and completely. And now the continent watches. Not just to see water held, but power released. Not just megawatts, but meaning. Not just a dam, but a message. Africa can do it. Alone if necessary. Together by choice. If that message stirs something in you. If you believe the people of Africa have waited long enough to be told, it's not your turn. Then don't stay silent. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, what does GERD mean for you, for your country, for Africa? Because this wasn't just a dam. It was a promise, kept. Long before the first shovel struck the earth at GERD, the war had already begun. Not with missiles, but with maps, treaties, and an idea that some rivers belong to some nations more than others. In 1929, a colonial treaty brokered by Britain gave Egypt virtual monopoly over the Nile. Ethiopia, which contributes over 85% of the river's water, wasn't even invited to the table. The logic was brutal and simple: Egypt needed water. Ethiopia didn't matter. That colonial logic was never rescinded. It was inherited. Like a deed to someone else's house. When Ethiopia began GERD, it didn't just pour concrete, it tore up a century of entitlement. And for Cairo, that was intolerable. Egypt's lifeline is the Nile. Over 90% of its population lives along it. Without it, there is no Cairo, no wheat, no survival. For decades, that fear translated into control. Any upstream project was seen not as development, but aggression. So when GERD rose, so did the voices in Cairo. Politicians called it a national threat. Generals spoke of existential danger. And in hushed, polished rooms, plans were drawn not for cooperation, but confrontation. The media joined in. Headlines screamed about water wars. Think tanks issued white papers. Western diplomats asked, why is Ethiopia being so reckless? But beneath the concern was a deeper panic. GERD was changing who got to say yes or no in Africa. Because GERD wasn't just a dam. It was a veto breaker. A line crosser. A symbol that Africa's upstream could now make decisions without downstream permission. Egypt responded with a full-spectrum campaign: legal, diplomatic, and psychological. They lobbied the UN Security Council, filed complaints to the African Union, rallied allies in Europe and the Gulf. They demanded a binding agreement that would regulate how Ethiopia filled and released water. Ethiopia refused. Not out of arrogance, but principle. This was not a nuclear program. It was a hydropower plant. It didn't consume water. It released it. And more importantly, it was on Ethiopian soil. The dam wouldn't stop the Nile. But it would stop the belief that Ethiopia must ask to use it. Negotiations dragged for years. Agreements were drafted and signed. Trust eroded. In 2020, as Ethiopia began the first stage of filling the reservoir, Cairo flinched. One senior Egyptian official declared, "We will not allow one drop to be taken from us." Another added, "All options are on the table." That phrase echoed. Because it wasn't just about water anymore. It was about sovereignty. Behind closed doors, intelligence was exchanged. Military options were weighed. The possibility of strikes, cyber, or even kinetic, was discussed in foreign capitals. GERD had become a geopolitical fault line. Sudan found itself in the middle. On one hand, GERD promised cheaper electricity and regulated water flow, potentially saving Sudan from catastrophic floods. On the other, there was fear that Ethiopia could unilaterally alter flows, damaging Sudanese dams and irrigation systems. Their position shifted with governments, with seasons, with pressure. Yet on the ground, reality spoke louder than talking points. In 2021, Sudan faced devastating floods. Entire towns submerged. Crops destroyed. Lives lost. Meanwhile, upstream, GERD absorbed excess rain, stabilizing flow. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was tangible. GERD had started doing what it promised: protect. Still, the headlines persisted. GERD threatens Egypt's future. Ethiopia playing with fire. Rarely did they mention how GERD also reduced drought risk, or how its reservoir could prevent famine downstream. Because acknowledging that would mean admitting Ethiopia had solved a problem others only politicized. That's why the war over GERD was never just about hydrology. It was about hierarchy. And GERD disrupted it. In Western capitals, discomfort grew. The usual model, Western-backed lender, Western-approved contractor, Western-led arbitration, didn't apply. Ethiopia had bypassed the old gates. And worst of all, it had succeeded. GERD was complete. And the Nile still flowed. But something else was flowing now, too, a different kind of current. Across Africa, leaders watched. If Ethiopia could defy Egypt and global pressure, what else was possible? Could Niger reclaim uranium? Could Mali control its airspace? Could Burkina Faso reject military aid and still win? GERD was not just the end of something. It was the beginning. And so the battle shifted from threats to narratives. Egypt intensified media campaigns. Ethiopia responded with silence. Not weakness, but calculation. Every time Ethiopia released an update, a turbine test, a structural report, it reminded the world, the project is moving forward. The river of time only flows one way. Still, tensions remain. Egypt continues to seek international pressure. Western nations continue to couch colonial assumptions in the language of stability. And the fear of a water war still lingers, not because of reality, but because of refusal to let go of a monopoly no longer enforceable. But in Benishangul Gumuz, where the dam now hums, that war feels far away. What they feel instead is light. Power. Control. A village that once had kerosene now has current. A student once squinting under candlelight now studies beneath LEDs. A country once called reckless now exports stability. And a continent once dismissed is watching. The question is no longer whether Ethiopia will complete the dam. It's whether the world can accept an Africa that no longer asks to build. Because GERD didn't take the Nile. It took back the right to choose. And sometimes, that is more dangerous than any war. Power is not always taken with guns. Sometimes, it arrives silently, on copper wires. Lit by turbines, humming through homes that once lived in darkness. And that is what Ethiopia has built, power without permission. When GERD came online, it wasn't just an engineering feat. It was a geopolitical signal. Ethiopia wasn't asking for aid. It was offering electricity. That shift, from borrower to supplier, rewrote the rules of East African diplomacy. 6 turbines now hum, feeding electricity into Ethiopia's national grid. But the plan goes far beyond borders. Through the Eastern Africa Power Pool, a network linking national grids across the region. Ethiopia is preparing to export electricity to Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti, and beyond. For countries long trapped in rolling blackouts and expensive diesel dependence, the offer is hard to refuse. Reliable, clean, and cheaper than alternatives, GERD's power isn't just a product. It's influence. And influence changes everything. In Kenya, government officials announced new talks to increase energy imports from Ethiopia. In Sudan, businesses quietly began preparing for grid synchronization. Djibouti's industrial parks, once dependent on fuel ships, are now planning expansions powered by hydropower. This isn't charity. This is leverage. Every megawatt Ethiopia sends across its borders is a thread in a new kind of alliance, one not built by colonial agreements or foreign aid packages, but by shared volts, shared futures. And as each country plugs in, the unspoken question rises: who really holds the switch? For decades, Egypt wielded that question like a sword. Its control of the Nile, enshrined in treaties, enforced through pressure, gave it disproportionate power in the region. But GERD flipped that equation. The Nile still flows north. But now, its electricity flows south, east, and west, from the highlands of Ethiopia, not the delta of Cairo. This is more than symbolism. It's infrastructure as strategy. Just as railroads defined empires in the 19th century. And internet cables map power in the 21st, power grids are the new arteries of sovereignty. Whoever supplies the current, shapes the current. Not just of lights and machines, but of alliances, trade, and politics. And Ethiopia knows it. GERD gives Addis Ababa a card it's never held before, the ability to make neighbors dependent on it, not the other way around. In negotiations, in summits, in silence, that power speaks louder than any speech. But this new role comes with a price, attention. The kind that doesn't always come with applause. Western analysts began warning of a rising Ethiopia. As if growth were a crime. Think tanks in Washington and Brussels published papers on energy hegemony in East Africa, framing Ethiopia's self-reliance as a threat. Investment reports cautioned about instability risks due to Ethiopia's unilateral development. But underneath the language of caution was a deeper discomfort: Ethiopia wasn't following the script. It wasn't waiting for permission, for funding, for approval. It wasn't calling Paris, London, or DC. It was calling the shots. For decades, the African energy story was one of dependence: diesel generators, World Bank-funded grids, emergency UN solar kits. GERD tore that narrative apart. And like all narratives, when they crumble, the architects of the old story start scrambling. But Africa started watching. In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré spoke of nationalizing energy production, of refusing fuel subsidies from the West, and building local microgrids. In Bamako, engineers studied the GERD model, not just the turbines, but the bonds, the community ownership. The refusal to wait. Because power is not just electricity. It's precedent. And GERD has set one. Sudan now has to balance its historical ties with Egypt against its economic interest in Ethiopia. Kenya, once wary of Ethiopia's ambitions, now sees it as a vital partner. Even Somalia, a country long fractured, has opened discussions about regional energy security, with Ethiopia at the table. This is a quiet shift, but a massive one. A transfer not of weapons or borders, but of centrality. Ethiopia, once peripheral in the regional order, is now at its center, not by demanding loyalty, but by powering necessity. And this power does something more subtle, more radical. It normalizes self-reliance. It makes sovereignty feel functional, not theoretical. It shows young Africans that energy independence is not a dream scribbled on paper, but a current that can be touched, used, lived. And that is what truly terrifies the old world order. Not that Ethiopia will cut off water, but that others will copy its will. Already, Burkina Faso is refining gold in state-run plants, bypassing French smelters. Niger is renegotiating uranium contracts. Mali is investing in local drone production. These are not isolated events. They are echoes of a new tone, one set by 6,450 megawatts, not megaphones. The power GERD generates is clean. But the message it sends is disruptive. Africa will not beg for light. It will build it. And those who controlled the darkness, with aid, with conditions, with warnings, now face something they never planned for, a continent that flips its own switch. So when the next summit begins, and Ethiopia speaks, the room will feel different. Not louder. Not bolder. But centered. Rooted. With the quiet certainty of a nation that knows what it's built. And knows it did not have to ask. That certainty is the real power. And no one can unplug it. They thought the danger was electricity. But it wasn't. It wasn't the turbines. It wasn't the reservoir. It wasn't even the water. The real threat was the blueprint. GERD is not a dam. It's a doctrine. A doctrine that says Africa can fund itself, build itself, power itself, without waiting. Without asking, without apologizing. That idea terrifies more capitals than any megawatt ever could. Because it spreads. You cannot contain electricity. And you cannot contain belief. From the Sahel to the Horn, that belief is catching fire. Not through speeches, but through silence. Through results. Through a farmer's field lit by local energy. Through a school that no longer shuts at sunset. Through a nation that said no, and still stood. That is the contagion they fear, self-reliance becoming standard. For decades, Africa's development was mapped by others. Built with borrowed money. Designed in foreign languages, delivered with fine print. GERD ripped that contract in half and printed its own, in Amharic, in sacrifice, in sovereignty. And the world noticed. Not because Ethiopia asked for attention. But because it stopped asking for permission. Now, every African leader who dreams of building without begging is watched. Every bond issued locally is questioned. Every speech about independence is framed as extremism. Burkina Faso knows this. So does Mali. So does Niger. Ibrahim Traoré doesn't quote donors. He quotes ancestors. He doesn't hold out his hands. He tills the ground. That's why they call him radical. That's why they call him dangerous. Not because he threatens stability. But because he threatens dependence. GERD and Traoré are not the same. One is a dam. One is a man. But their message is identical. Africa is no longer asking. And that message, powered by water, multiplied by youth, anchored by land, is beginning to rewrite the future in real time. But that future is not guaranteed. The backlash has already begun. Disinformation flows as fast as the Nile. Articles painting GERD as reckless. Reports labeling Traoré as unstable. Sanctions whispered in meeting rooms. Financial tools sharpened into weapons. They know they cannot stop the turbines. So they target the narrative. Because they understand something we too often forget: power is never just about machines. It's about meaning. And GERD, in its silence, in its steel, in its stubborn defiance, means everything. Not because it lit a village. But because it lit a path. The lights are on. And so is the world. For the first time in generations, Africa is not defined by what it lacks, but by what it builds. The grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a continent that remembers who it is. A dam made without donors. A people who refuse to beg. A river that no longer obeys colonial commands. This is not just Ethiopia's triumph. It is a mirror held up to every African nation that still doubts its own hands. GERD is proof. Sovereignty is possible. Power is buildable. Freedom is not a speech, it is a switch. And when one nation dares to flip it, others will follow. If this moved you, like this video. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe to this channel. Not because we need numbers. But because we need each other. Africa is rising, not on paper, but in concrete, in crops, in current. Now is not the time for silence. Now is the time for solidarity. Because they built a dam. Now we build a destiny.